broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to greet you and to welcome you on behalf of the NBSAP Forum to this third webinar of Part 2 of the Introduction to Resilience for Development MOOC, Applying Resilience Thinking to National Biodiversity Plans, offered by the United Nations Development Program. My name is Marcela Torres, and I'm a consultant on sustainable development and green economy. I'm also your facilitator throughout the entire course. We are grateful for your participation in this third webinar, titled Resilience of Protected Areas in Face of Climate Change, which will be presented by Andrew Rhodes. Andrew Rhodes is General Director of the ProNatura system and Chair of the IUCN Working Group on Climate Change and Protected Areas. He has more than 12 years of experience working in the conservation of Mexico's natural capital. Since 2011, he has held several executive positions in the National Commission of Natural Protected Areas, CONANP. As General Director for Institutional Development, he strengthened the international agenda and the international designations, or coordinated the 2040 strategy and the successful implementation of COP13 in Cancun. Prior to CONANP, Andrew coordinated the Fund for Natural Protected Areas of the Mexican Fund for Nature Conservation. Andrew is a biologist from the University of the Americas, Puebla, with studies at the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom and at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. In this webinar, he explains that the planet is warming and change is all around. Change and transformation are the constant, not the exception. Protected areas are recognized as natural solutions to climate change, but they too need to respond to be more resilient. Protected areas facilitate the continuity of ecological processes that lead to the production and supply of ecosystem services for human populations. Therefore, increasing the resilience of protected areas provides not only ecological but also social and economic benefits. This multidimensional context in a rapid changing environment increases the uncertainty for management decisions. Hence, incorporating resilience thinking into the management of protected areas becomes fundamental for the planet. Welcome, Andrew, and thank you for accepting this invitation. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you very much, Marcela. I hope you can hear me perfectly. And thank you for the NBSAP Forum for hosting this.
Thank you so much. Before we begin, I would like to remind all of you of some rules and dynamics in the NBSAP Forum webinar sessions. Microphones will be muted during the presentation. This reduces interferences and facilitates communication. We will have a 30-minute presentation followed by 30 minutes of questions and answers. Please send us in advance your questions or raise your hand in the control panel of GoToWebinar. If you want to speak and the connection allows it, I will open your microphones during the Q&A session. This session is being recorded and will be available on the NBSAP Forum website, www.nbsapforum.net. All participants will receive an email with a link to watch it as well as a PDF copy of the presentation and a list of resources related to the topic. Now I will transfer the webinar to Andrew. We hope you enjoy this session.
Thank you very much, and thank you all who are listening to this interesting webinar. As Marcela said, the title of this presentation is Resilience for Protected Areas in Face of Climate Change. I'm Andrew Rhodes. I currently work for ProNatura, which is the largest NGO in Mexico. It's a large network of NGOs in Mexico, and I have previous experience as Climate Change Director for the National Commission for Protected Areas in Mexico, and as Marcela said, I'm the standing chair for the specialist group of protected areas and climate change of the WCPA IUCN. She also stated the storyline of this presentation, and let me take you back to that storyline. It is a fact that the planet is warming, and there are changes that we're observing all around. Protected areas were recognized as a static long-term investment on the conservation of biodiversity, but that change and transformation are affecting some elements of them. They're also seen as natural solutions to climate change, and we'll talk about that. But they also need to respond and be more resilient to the change and transformation that we're observing in the ecosystems and, let's say, human systems. Uncertainty is increasing all around. Taking into account those changes and transformations of the ecosystems. Uncertainty, we have to learn how to manage it, and that's going to be a huge challenge for PA managers. So resilience thinking and management of PAs becomes fundamental. One, in developing countries, PAs are basically the best tool to conserve biodiversity and also to protect ecosystem services that provide human well-being. Also in developed countries, protected areas are a huge investment in, let's say, water security and some other elements. So the protection and proper management of protected areas becomes fundamental for human well-being all around. And with a huge area of change and transformation, resilience thinking, management of PAs are truly important. So the next slide shows you what I believe it's one of the best graphics of the fifth assessment report of the IPCC, and it shows the observed impacts attributed to climate change. So it's not the usual expected impacts of climate change, but the observed impacts verified by scientific articles, peer-reviewed all around the planet. So there's climate change impacts going through the planet, and it's not just what we expect to come in the following years, but it's currently happening, and that's really threatening, and that's really worrying. When I worked at the National Commission of Protected Areas in Mexico, I remember we started the talks to the PA managers around climate change, and they said, and I remember this perfectly, they said, climate change, it's a fashion, it's going to come like some other buzzword and then go. But probably 10 years after that, let's say, first talks within the institution, now PA managers are identifying observed impacts on climate change on their protected areas, and they're really worried about what's going on. So it's not what is going to happen, it's happening right now. And this graph, which I invite you to read in the report, it's a perfect example of it. But also, we can expect regional risks and identify them through the planet. In North America, increased damages from wildfires. California is one of the best examples, but also in Mexico, we have huge examples of increase and stronger wildfires all around that obviously affect protected areas. There's also observed and expected impacts of climate change, not only to ecosystems, but also to, let's say, human and managed systems, and obviously the physical systems of the planet. And this graph tells you and basically shows you all around the planet different risks and obviously potential of risk reductions of them that you can work on. So the basic point here is climate change is happening. I'm not going to get into detail of it. There are obviously observed impacts of climate change within protected areas or surrounding areas of protected areas. So we have to do something about it. No? And things are changing, and it's amazing. Now, protected areas have been identified as natural solutions to climate change, basically because they have generally 6 roles that we discussed several years ago. One, they're natural solution to conserve biodiversity. In many countries, protected areas are the best solution to protect and conserve biodiversity. It's the strongest instrument many countries have in their legislation to protect biodiversity. Therefore, in many occasions, they protect ecosystem services also. Some protected areas were designed and decreed to protect and provide specific ecosystem services as carbon or risk reduction, or even water mainly. But also protected areas design and implementation, and obviously creation, they promote the connectivity within landscapes. And obviously, they are a huge tool to capture and store carbon all around, not only green carbon, but also blue carbon. They also help social systems to build knowledge and understanding of the ecosystems, its processes, its logic behind. Many of us grew near protected areas or within protected areas, and they help you understand the logic of the ecosystems. But they also help inspire people. If you've ever been to a protected area, there's immediate sensation that inspires you peace and understanding, and basically creates bridges of empathy to your surrounding. So protected areas is not just solutions to climate change in storing, capturing carbon, but also inspiring those greater things. And there are many examples of these all around. Many protected areas in Latin America protect the most important watersheds or mangrove forests and many other ecosystems. So protected areas have been an excellent example of what can contribute to climate change. And currently, with the Aichi Target 11, the expansion of protected areas has been impressive. Not only terrestrial but also marine. So they are a concrete example of a tool to protect biodiversity, enhance carbon storage, and also build knowledge and understanding for people. The next slide shows you a very concrete examples that I had a chance to work in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. At the right of the slide, you can see a map, and that's the Siancan Biosphere Reserve. Different colors, you can see the mangroves, the mangrove forests, marshes, Petén mangroves, and specific dots of the sampling sites that we went out to the field and collected information on carbon and mangroves. Just that biosphere reserve, if destroyed by land use change of, let's say, expansion of hotels or something in that region of the Caribbean and Mexico, would alone release about half of the annual emissions of all Mexico in 2009. And that's just mangroves within this biosphere reserve in the Yucatan Peninsula. Okay, so that is a natural solution. By protecting this biosphere reserve and all the ecosystems within, you are contributing to the mitigation agenda of a country, and that's just one PA of several hundred that Mexico has. So one of the conclusions of this paper is that, well, effective climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies should aim at maintaining and restoring the exceptional large carbon stocks of the mangroves of this biosphere reserve in the Yucatan Peninsula. So protected areas contribute not only to the mitigation agenda, but the adaptation agenda simultaneously. And that was one of the challenges that we learned at the National Commission of Protected Areas in Mexico. It's difficult to differentiate between mitigation and adaptation on the ground. Usually they're embedded, and that's also a win-win solution. So again, natural solutions, protected areas are a clear example of it. You adapt to climate change by protecting mangroves of this Siancan Biosphere Reserve to reduce risk reduction of communities inland, and at the same time you are storing large amounts of carbon stocks in there. So it's a win-win solutions. And like this example, there are many around. Many countries are designing currently towards reaching our Aichi Target 11 protected areas to reduce the risk in face of tsunamis or hurricanes or many other extreme weather events. So protected areas are an excellent tool for the climate change agenda, but they obviously contribute in a significant way to the ecosystem services they provide to human well-being. A huge amount of sustainable lobster is fished here in the Sankan Biosphere Reserve by local communities. So they've established a permanent long-term system fishing sustainable lobster on those spots, and they too contribute to the restoration activities of the mangroves in the Biosphere Reserve. So it's a systemic, integral part of it, of all the work that is done in a protected area. But it also showcases the complexity of managing a protected area. In many developing countries, there are activities going within the protected areas. There are people living within the protected area. In that map that you see, all those locations, Chamac, La Raya, El Playón, Punta Gorda, Vigía, Chico, are fishing, very small fishing communities that live permanently within the protected area. So many management categories of protected areas in Mexico permit people living within PAs, and that's a huge challenge because it's not just no go, no take, no touch PAs, but you have to manage them, and that's a huge element that you have to take into account in a changing and transforming environment exacerbated by climate change. So it's quite a complex thing to do. So management of PAs becomes even more complex with all these multifactorial elements going around, and suddenly this huge and enormous and complex exacerbated element as climate change that just takes you around. I want to take you to another example, and this is just I want to reflect with you. You probably know about the monarch butterfly biosphere reserve. It's another protected area in the central part of Mexico, within two Mexican states, Estado de Mexico and Michoacán. And you know it's the pinnacle of the migratory phenomenon of the monarch butterfly. So you can see pictures. I took these pictures 2 weekends ago that I went there. So it's amazing the colonies they form and all around these two states in this biosphere reserve. But the colonies are very susceptible to climate and humidity variables. So climate change are affecting those colonies. And there's not just one colony, there are around 10, 12 colonies, some open to tourism, some closed to tourism. But they're changing, they're never static. Once they get to a place and times goes by from November to March, they change slightly within the biosphere reserve. Now, decrease of PAs are static and they do not move, but the colonies of monarch butterflies, they do move, and they're starting to move sometimes out of the perimeter of the PA. And that's a huge challenge for managers, because within PAs, the managers can take basically most of the decisions, but once they're outside of it, things change. So many conservation targets, objectives of PAs all around the planet were thought at long-term, persistent. They wouldn't change. Reality nowadays is something different. So taking into account all those elements of the social, economic systems and ecosystems, climate change into account just shifts all what we thought as permanent. One of the main challenges of the monarch butterfly, yes, it is the migratory route and all the pesticides and herbicides used to it, But in the colonies, now that the illegal logging has gone down significantly, it's climate change, because the colonies are going outside of the PA decree. And now, what should we do? And that's something we have to discuss further away. Now, I had the opportunity to work with two important tools. One tool I believe you learn about and probably read on this course, which is the best practice guide on adapting to climate change, which is a guidance specifically for managers and planners for PAs, but also took advantage and included another. It's not a tool, but it's a strategy, and it's a strategy focused on system of protected areas, which is different. So we have one scale, which is the managing of a PA, but also now how to manage a system of protected areas. So I'm going to talk about that strategy further along the presentation, which is, I think, really important. It was launched on the World Parks Congress at Australia some years ago, and Adapting to Climate Change was launched also a couple of years ago in some of the same venues. So we're gonna talk about the guidance, the best practice guideline, which is a tool for managers, and let's say the experience of this strategy that looks more into the system of protected areas, at least in one country, this country being Mexico. And obviously you have the links for the complete PDFs of them. So, talking about the strategy of protected areas, the concept and the policy of climate change in Mexico jump-started with a COP that was celebrated in Cancun some years ago, and therefore all the public federal administration had to incorporate climate change into its daily work. As I said before, it was complicated. Many PA managers that were there for many years, 20, 30 years as managers, thought it as a, let's say, fashion, something that will come and go. Now, obviously, their mindset has changed significantly. But to complete that instruction of incorporating climate change to the, let's say, national policy, there was a first strategy for climate change, and it was called the Climate Change Strategy for Protected Areas. And basically what it did, it was a classic strategy that identified mitigation and adaptation strategies for protected areas. And we started to implement that strategy, but things were not properly, let's say, envisioned. They didn't have a logic from the ground, and it was really complicated to incorporate actions and activities or the daily work for the managers. And also the logic behind, the logic of PAs being affected by climate change, being impacted by climate change, but not seen as a solution. So a couple of 3-4 years after implementing that strategy, we decided to, let's say, take a more closer look to the role of protected areas, and that recalls to the natural solutions concept. And if we assume that protected areas are a natural solution to climate change, then it should change the impacts to protected areas, and more how protected areas are a solution from. So it changed the logic of the strategy to climate change strategy from protected areas as a solution to climate change. And it had 4, let's say, main pillars of work. The main pillar was cooperation and coordination, a second pillar of a landscape approach. The third pillar, it's knowledge. And the fourth pillar is governance participation. So it completely broke the idea of adaptation and mitigation strategies, because, as I said before, you can see them linked very closely on the ground. So it's very complicated to differentiate between adaptation and mitigation if you're doing restoration of mangroves, for instance. No? Even though you have a clear objective, it's to reduce risk, it contributes to the mitigation agenda. So these 4 pillars were more fundamental, more clear of the importance of PAs and a broader landscape. And it has been a very interesting success here in Mexico. And it also links to the idea of, well, if you're less resilient, then you're more vulnerable. No? If you're more vulnerable, if you're more resilient, sorry, then you're more vulnerable. You're less vulnerable. And it has some elements very interesting, the strategy, and then many tools have developed after this strategy. So it's important to also not to see PAs as a standalone in face of climate change. We need to see PAs as a whole system, obviously in countries, but also in regions and worldwide. So PAs are a global strategy to tackle climate change. They are a global strategy, they are a natural solution to climate change. So this tool, I think, this example, I think it's very good. So you can learn more about it. And one of the elements of this strategy that was disseminated in an important way was the concept of resilience. Happily enough, resilience was incorporated into the legislation of Mexico by law. So it was quite a very interesting example of how to include resilience, how to see the role of protected areas as a natural solution to climate change, and put it in very simple terms for managers. Now, the other tool is a best practice guideline for managers, and it basically takes you in a route, in a cycle of that adaptation cycle that most of you know. I'm not going to get into details of this because everything is there in the best practice guideline that I encourage you to read. There are many case studies that you can draw from and obviously learn. So the first step of it is to build strong foundations, either focusing on species or ecosystems. But you have to have all the elements of it. The second part, obviously, is to assess the vulnerability and risk, obviously by assessing exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity of that element that you chose, either species or ecosystems of a specific PA. Thirdly, obviously, it shows you how to identify and select adaptations options, either to reduce exposure, sensitivity, or increase adaptive capacity of that species or ecosystems that you chose and you selected. Finally, how to identify and implement actions of practice, policy, or institutional changes that you have to do either to reduce exposure, sensitivity, or increase adaptive capacity. And one of the best elements is how to monitor and adjust the strategy. And that number five step is sometimes that we usually forget, and it's the capacity to learn. If we do not learn from every initiative, project, program that we implement, then it's very feasible that you're going to repeat the same mistakes once and again. And also learning is a basic principle for resilience thinking. The framework behind the best practice guideline, and this graphic, it's really interesting because it takes you from the idea of, let's say, either hands-off, let's see what happens, to active intervention and managing PAs. No? So hands-off, climate change impacts, let's see what happens. No? Let it go. Toss the coin. Or active intervention. And then obviously recognizing that, well, there's persistence, but the reality is that, as I said before, changes and transformation are happening all around. Ecosystems are transforming, they're changing. So we decided to put this this graph to basically show you, let's say, 4 scenarios that you can work on. Hands off, it's going to transform, well, accept system changes. But we believe that active intervention and transformation can go hand by hand to facilitate system realignment. And that means also increasing the variables for the resilience of the systems. So their functions persist. Probably there are going to be structural changes, but their functions, which is fundamental for human well-being, should continue. So I invite you to study this graph. One case study that the best practice guidelines showcase is this from Central Mexico, and I took advantage of it. So once Mexico decided to launch its climate change strategy from protected areas, it then looked into what we call adaptation programs for climate change in PAs. But as I said before, one of the core elements of that strategy was landscape approach, a landscape seascape approach. So we didn't do adaptation programs for specific PAs, but rather clusters of PAs. No? So in that map, on the right hand of the slide, you can see in yellow some of the PAs, and in green the entire region, the ecosystem, let's say, they were trying to manage in face of climate change. So it's a landscape approach that we also included, let's say, the socioeconomic elements of that region, because many communities live within or in the surrounding areas, in the influence areas, transition areas of PAs. So the approach was a ecosystem-based adaptation approach to identify the strategies that we should follow in face of climate change, and many challenges that we went through. Languages, for instance, governance, different structures of governance around indigenous communities here, a huge area of opportunity, governance and climate change. So this case study is shown in the best practice guideline, and it follows the 4 steps, the 5 steps that we just talked about. We focus on the ecosystems and on the human activities within the PAs and the region of interest. We then assess the vulnerability to climate change. We identify the strategies to follow. We then implemented those strategies, and then we are currently monitoring the impacts of those strategies, either for species, ecosystems, or people's livelihoods. But I again go back to the framework of the best practice guideline, and it's fundamental that once you decide to work on a, let's say, regional or local protected area, you identify which of these, let's say, 4 scenarios you're gonna promote, because it's fundamental. It is the element that decides what kind of strategies you're going to follow. So facilitate system realignment, so you have to increase several variables of resilience and some other things, or you're just going to accept system changes. But this is something fundamental that has to be related to the policy of the institution, the public policy, or your individual views of it. The best practice guidelines also has, I think, an approach to a tool that I invite you to learn more about. It's a tool for scenario planning, and it's related specifically to how to manage uncertainty. So basically, scenario planning is, let's say, a collaborative process to identify alternative, different scenarios, to consider the implications of that scenario, and then obviously explore actions and decisions that are most effective in preparing and responding for changing conditions. So this tool is pretty handy with climate change and all the uncertainty around. Many institutions use scenario planning. Many defense institutions of several countries use scenario planning to decide what to do in a constant changing scenario and condition. So there's a complete section for this scenario planning tool in the best practice guideline, and I encourage you to really get into it, because it helps to reason that there's no cause and effect strategy that will help you properly and effectively manage a PA. You have to have several scenarios due to the constant changing conditions. Now I go back to the example of the monarch butterfly biosphere reserve and how to incorporate resilience thinking into it. As I said before, there are several colonies within the PA, and there's a huge uncertainty if they're going to be within or outside the decreed PA, not the boundaries of it. So one of the policies has been to be redundant, to protect all the colonies and the potential sites where the next year the migration will come. So it's fundamental to incorporate redundancy as an element of resilience. Also, there's a huge policy now in Mexico strengthening connectivity of ecosystems. So the idea is to obviously go further from the PAs and enhance and manage connectivity of ecosystems to promote potential colonies of monarch butterflies that do change even when they're established within the region. So another principle of resilience thinking is how to manage connectivity. And for the first time in several years, there's a huge project and initiatives from obviously led by CONAB, but in coordination with WWF Mexico, ProNatura, and several other NGOs on the migratory route of the monarch butterfly. So connectivity is not only to promote healthy ecosystems for colonies of monarch butterflies in the biosphere reserve and surrounding areas, but also the connectivity in the migratory route. As I said before, a problem as complex as climate change, and with all the multifactorial and all the elements around of social and economic systems, you have several stakeholders here, and you need to broaden participation. You need to include as many stakeholders as you can to tackle the challenge. So in the concrete example of the biosphere itself, we're talking about local communities that are owners of the forests. We're talking about tourism entrepreneurs that are starting and jump-starting several companies on moving tourism from Mexico City, 26 million people going to see the monarch butterfly in a sustainable way. It's how to also in some surrounding areas work with the legal logging companies that are there, in managing forests. It's how to include civil society participation there, obviously academia and scientific works going to the biosphere. So you have to broaden participation in order to include as many perspectives as you can to tackle the challenge, and that increases the resilience of the area. And as I said before, that fifth element of the best practice guideline on monitoring and putting into black and white paper what you learn from the strategy you want to implement on the ground is fundamental. You have to encourage learning. If you do not learn, you do not grow. And learning is, I think, one of the, for me, the most important element of resilience. You have to learn, but you have to put it literally on black and white, and put it into discussion in those participatory forums, so people can discuss and really strengthen learning. So just like a glimpse, a quick look to some of the resilience principle, and how those principles can be incorporated into, let's say, quite a big scale of managing a biosphere reserve as complex as a mother butterfly. That I believe there are many examples like this all around the planet. That we thought PAs were static, we thought PAs will persist, and things wouldn't change there. Resilience thinking, it's fundamental to manage those PAs, not only for the monarch butterfly as the main conservation target of this biosphere reserve, but for all the ecosystem services they provide for human well-being. Things are changing and transforming. We have to embrace that change. We have to create the conditions to enhance the resilience of those elements, so they can obviously tackle those changes in a more robust way. Finally, I want to obviously share the works of the specialist group of climate change and PAs of the World Commission of Protected Areas. If you're interested on more examples, case studies, getting involved on these discussions and works, this group builds obviously on the contributions and experts and expertise of many experts and practitioners all around the planet, and tries to obviously coordinate short, long-term strategies. There's a link to the webpage of the group. There's a strategic framework that we're working on. So if you're interested in joining the group, please go into that webpage, and you can obviously look for the contact details of all the staff working on that group, and get involved in these discussions that takes you all around the planet to see different examples. Not only the monarch butterfly, but in that picture you can see one of Colombia's protected areas in the Páramos. So if you're interested, go in, send us an email, and we can talk more about this. So thank you very much for your time. The English chip started to get in at the end of this talk, so I'm sorry about that. I had a very early meeting this morning in Spanish, so it's sometimes complicated to move around languages, but I hope you enjoyed and understood the talk. Well, Marcela, thank you very much.
Many thanks, Andrew. That was a great presentation, really interesting and relevant topic for our NBSAP Forum members. I'm sure our participants found your presentation valuable for implementing their NBSAPs. I would like to invite participants to share their questions, doubts and comments, or raise their hands to participate in the Q&A session. Please use the control panel of the GoToWebinar platform. I can open your microphone or read your question depending on your preference. So let's see if we have some questions. Anybody raising their hands? Sorry, that was my cat, but she's not going to ask any questions right now. We have, yes, we have some questions coming in, Andrew. Here's a question. Deborah Lee, I hope I pronounced it correctly, says, I'd like to ask about governance and enforcement. How do you actually ensure that the plans are being followed and respected? I ask especially in the cases where poaching, illegal hunting, etc. undermine adaptation efforts, and in some cases are a competition with climate change, in the sense that climate change impacts in hunting, etc. are both equally having devastating impacts.
Thank you, Marcela. Law enforcement. It's a huge deal, and it's very complex. I'm going to go back to a very concrete example, and it is one example that probably it's in all papers around. I'm going to talk about the vaquita in the Gulf of California and Mexico, and then I'm going to give just a commercial. First, the commercial. There's there's going to be a launch of a MOOC of IUCN, specifically talking about law enforcement. So if you go to the IUCN webpage, you can, and the WCPA, you can look for that MOOC on law enforcement and PAs. Now, going back to the vaquita example, it is a tragedy what is happening with the vaquita in the upper part of the Gulf of California, and it basically goes to enforcement, law enforcement. The strategy that many administrations, federal administrations, followed in Mexico was let's say, to enhance enforcement, basically by putting more guns and boats there. Even the Marines were there. But this strategy hasn't been successful for all the years that we've worked with vaquita in the upper Gulf of California. Suddenly, the second phase of the strategy went in, and the government, together with civil society, decided to invest in a second element. The second element was to increase the, let's say, activities, sustainable activities of fishermen and obviously their families around the upper Gulf of California, because as you know, the main threat of the vaquita is the illegal poaching of totoaba gill that is sold in the Chinese market. 1 kilo of that bladder, of the bladder of totoaba, it's around $14,000 per kilo. So it's a huge business. So the second strategy was to increase, let's say, approach activities in order to reduce the need to go out and illegally poach totoaba. So it didn't work. It didn't work. So first strategy, more guns, not working. Second strategy, try to promote sustainable activities for communities. It's not working. And until now, after obviously the tryouts of getting some vaquitas to do some ex situ conservation strategies, didn't help. Also, now we're starting to work with participation, governance, and things are starting to change. Sadly, too late for it. No, but what we learn in law enforcement, at least in PAs, in my case in Mexico, is you have to do a multi-approach perspective. So it is, yes, having, let's say, enforcement there, but if there's no real multi-stakeholder approach to enhance participation and therefore hopefully governance, it's you're never going to get there. So that's a very concrete example of the vaquita, that millions and millions and millions of dollars have been put it for its conservation, and basically no success in that. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. We have more questions coming in. Let's see. Michael Underwood asks, says, yes, I understand landscapes. Been around for at least 40 years to my knowledge, so I don't make a mistake. What is the antithesis or opposite? Is it silo? Thanks, Mike.
Like,
what's the opposite to landscapes? Is it a silo approach?
It is a silo approach. It is a side-by-side approach.
Right.
So it's just taking into account the concrete boundaries of a PA decreed. Mm-hmm. So it is going beyond the PAs.
Okay. Here's an interesting question from Rocio Luz Elena. She says, thanks for this great speech. Do you think is it possible to conserve PAs with people living inside them? Could you explain a little more about Colombian experience in the Páramos?
Yes, I do believe it's possible. The main challenge is what is the objective of that PA, no? I also believe in the importance of no-take zones in PAs. We have very successful examples here in Mexico on PAs with people living within them. So there was an article published several years ago from the National University of Mexico, and what they did is they took all the PAs in Mexico and analyzed the deforestation rates within PAs, in the surrounding areas of PAs, and let's say in a buffer of 20, 25, 30 kilometers from the PA. So let's say 3 scales. And all the management categories, from national parks to, we have in Mexico a biosphere reserve with a management category for sustainable use. And what they did is they took all the PAs, the terrestrial PAs, did the deforestation rates for those 3 areas, and then cross-check with all the management categories. One would thought or would think that the most strict PAs, like national parks, would have, let's say, less deforestation rates than others. This was not the result of the study. The study showed that the management category of biosphere reserve that permits sustainable use was or were the PAs with less deforestation in Mexico. So that's a very concrete example of the effectivity, let's say, of PAs with people living within them. So, or in surrounded areas of PAs. So yes, I believe PAs can have people living within them and contribute to the sustainable use, management, and obviously conservation. But as I said in the beginning, I also believe that there should be no-take zones, completely no-take zones, terrestrial and marine, for other conservation targets. And I don't work with the Páramo example of Colombia, but if you go into the webpage of the IUCN Climate Change Specialist Group, one of our experts, Oscar Guevara from WF Colombia, could give you more details of that concrete example.
Thank you so much, Andrew. We have another question from Marilyn Micheni. She says, thank you for the presentation. Which are some of the guiding, binding policy and legal commitments at the global level that can be referenced in developing national and subnational policies and legislation?
Well, currently, one of the elements that I love from the Paris Agreement, at least in several countries, are the national determined contributions of countries. We all remember the failure of the previous agreement, on which, again, trying to impose targets for all countries was basically a failure and obviously impossible. This new approach of, let's say, voluntary schemes in order to identify concrete targets from countries, I think it was an excellent approach. So the national determined contributions of the countries, in some cases like Mexico, not only identify and defined mitigation targets, but also elements for adaptation. In the case of Mexico, one of the strategies was to enhance ecosystem-based adaptation, and also enhancing connectivity between PAs. So with that element put forward by our Foreign Affairs Ministry, it's excellent. It's an excellent excuse for civil society like mine to grasp that, bring it back to the country and say, okay, you committed to this. How are we going to work on EVA and connectivity between PAs in Mexico? So that's way of doing it. The other way, let's say, changing the multilateral multilateral agreement are the NBSAPs. No? In Mexico, we launched our the new version of our NBSAP in the last COP13 here in Mexico, and also establishes very concrete examples of PAs and climate change. So that's another tool that really helps countries, and it depends on the perspective and work you do, but grasp that tool and get it back to the countries. We sometimes forget the importance of multilateral agreements, and they're a powerful tool to, let's say, promote, encourage governments to do their part.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Andrew. Now we have a couple of related questions. We have Christopher Manda asking about the privatization of protected areas, and Kop Narayan asking about community protected areas. I will read both questions, and perhaps you can try to link the answer because they seem to be related. Christopher says, thanks for the informative presentation and more elaborate. Most of the protected areas in developing countries are being privatized as a way to ensure effective and efficient management of biodiversity in the event of climate change management. Based on your experience, how can we best achieve climate change management in the advent of cost and profit making of the park management? And then Kop Narayan asks, there is always debate on management aspects of PAs. Currently, in our case, it is controlled under government. Some people believe that it should go in the hands of community. What do you think?
Okay, so, as I said before, and something that I've learned in Mexico is that you have to work case by case. The context is, the political, social context is changing all the time, and it's amazing how one PA neighboring another could basically have entirely another context, another problems to solve. So I'm going to obviously answer these questions from my perspective in Mexico, and obviously some cases in Latin America. So in some countries, private PAs are an excellent tool to increase area and expansions of PAs. For instance, in Mexico, we have a voluntary scheme for PAs that a private citizen or even a local community can, let's say, decree. It is not an official decree, but it's a certificate that recognizes that area as an official PA. Okay, so many private enterprises or cattle ranchers or communities have been recognized by this voluntary scheme, and let's say the area that they've decided it's now an official federal PA, with all the elements that it brings to it. In some cases, the ecosystems are so sensitive, so delicate, that in face of climate change, their management has to be really strict, very professional. So in those cases, public-private partnership are effective to manage, for instance, tourism. No? In other cases where you can have, let's say, the capacity of the ecosystems to incorporate impacts from tourism, it's let's say more flexible. Then another approach can be used. So there is no one fits all formula. It really depends on the case by case that you want to tackle. Many communities, indigenous communities or rural communities in Latin America, their conservation areas are as an effective as any federal national park. So again, it really has to be, let's say, an approach. The challenge is to have the portfolio of options to decide, no? And as I said before, the scenario planning, no? In face of climate change and transformation, what are those 3, 4, 5 scenarios that we should push public policy to enhance, let's say, their investment, no? Into local managed communities, or private PAs, or national parks, or in the case of Mexico, biosphere reserve. I don't know. It's as I said before, there is no one fit all formula.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I'm looking at the attendees and seeing if anyone is raising their hands. It would be really good if you could ask your questions live. That would really help us and help you as well to interact with Andrew instead of me reading the questions. Although I have no problem, but it would be great if you could raise your hands. Lucia, can I open the microphone for you? Lucia?
No.
Are you okay? You have a very good question. I can read it, but you can say it also. Okay. Do you want to say it or do you want me to read it?
Yeah.
Go ahead. You were asking about environmental safeguards, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, Lucia says she has a lot of background noise, so I'm going to read her question for her. It's a very good question. It says, have you had any experience using environmental safeguards to implement any adaptation plan for these protected areas? How do environmental safeguards operate in the framework of the NBSAP in Mexico?
Hello?
Hello?
Yeah, okay. I put the mute thing.
Oh, okay.
So that's an excellent question.
Yes.
So, well, the first principle behind it, at least in PAs, is that the implementation of any adaptation or mitigation strategy in PAs has not an additional or incremental impact on the PA. No? That's one of the basic principles behind this. I don't know the second part of the question. How does it operate into the framework of the NBSAP in Mexico? I'm not sure, but obviously some elements of the legislation in Mexico obviously are included into the proper implementation of the NBSAP, due obviously to the mandatory element of implementing the strategy and action plan. But that's a good question. The second part of it. The first one is it's a principle that it shouldn't affect other elements of the PA. And obviously, Marcela, I'm gonna share all the articles I'm talking about. The carbon one, the other from the biosphere reserve, which is I think it's very important. And I believe there's a second part to that article of the deforestation rates. And it's more focused on the social and human indicators of human well-being within PAs. I'm going to also share that article, and I have some others related to obviously to climate change.
Excellent. If you send those, I will upload them to the NBSAP forum so that all participants can have access to them and download them as they wish. We have a hand raised. Woohoo! Jeffrey Potent. I'm going to open the mic for you. Hi, Jeffrey.
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Hi, I'd like to ask our guest speaker if there's any coordination between the monarch butterfly protected area in Mexico and similar areas in the United States, and if so, if you could provide the names of any organizations that you might be working with in the States.
Hello, thank you, Jeffrey. That's an excellent question. There is, as you probably know, in North America, one formal forum for coordination between the heads of agencies of PAs. It's called NAPA, which is a North American Wilderness and Protected Areas. And on that, let's say, coalition sits Parks Canada, obviously National Park Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the Bureau of Land Management, and the Forest Service from the U.S. There's sometimes on and on that NOAA and the USGS go in, and from Mexico it's CONAM, which is the National Commission for Protected Areas. So the first instance is that overall heads of agencies process and meetings that they collaborate. Unfortunately, in some recent years, that collaboration has not been as optimal as we would like it to be. But hopefully in the near future that will change. Now, in another, let's say, scale, there are several areas that have a sister park relation between Mexico and specifically the US. One concrete example is the Big Bend National Park, and its sister park is Maderas del Carmen and Caño Santa Elena in Mexico. Another concrete example is White Sands National Park and Cuatro Ciénegas in Mexico. And there is no formal sister park relation of the monarch butterfly biosphere reserve with another in the US. Several organizations are working on the migratory route. One concrete example that expands both borders is obviously WF in the US and WF here in Mexico, and also Pronatura has a lot of work in the migratory route. Another forum that it's in discussion right now that you probably obviously know is the CEC, the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, that is derived from NAFTA. It has a strong work on monarch butterfly, and there's a huge element and information, documents, articles that you can find there in the CEC platform.
Great, thank you very much. That's very helpful.
No worries.
Thank you so much, Andrew. We really appreciate all the time and dedication you have given us. I want to ask one last time if there are any more questions. You can send them in writing or raise your hands. Well, you still have some time. In the meantime, I would like to ask Andrew if you could please share with us any final remarks on the topic or any recommendations that you may have for our participants today.
Yes, probably I'm going to put forward a challenge. As many of you know, in basically 2 years' time, it's a 2020 year. It's a super year, and many agreements, multilateral agreements, are going to have a huge discussion. For instance, the CBD, the strategic plan, or the CBD, it's coming to an end. So the question now is what's going to happen after 2020 target that year. So are we going to, in the case of PAs, work on a similar target, the target 11 of the Aichi, as 17% protected terrestrial and 10% marine, obviously with elements of management effectiveness and connectivity. What should be the next target? How should we link that target with the 2030 agenda of the SDGs and obviously the climate change agenda of the NDCs? How can we bring together those elements? That principle of resilience thinking. So it's 2020, we're there. What should be the next target? How can we enhance, let's say, a multifactorial approach on one target hits all, like those bargains that you get in some supermarkets, like buy one get four free or something. How can we get into that discussion at the 2020? I think that's pretty relevant for the participants. I believe that they can work through their countries towards those negotiations, push forward the agenda of protected areas as a natural solutions for climate change, and obviously natural solutions as obviously a tool also to enhance sustainable development. I'm a believer of national parks and protected areas. I believe they are an excellent instrument not only to conserve biodiversity and provide ecosystem services, but also for human well-being. So what should we expect? What should we do for the 2020 target? Thank you, Marcela.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Once again, that's really interesting. It's a big challenge we have ahead of us, and I really appreciate you posing that challenge to our participants, because it's what we have to start thinking about today. Well, before we close, I would like to remind all participants to please finish their online lessons on time in order to obtain their certificates of completion by 12 February, which is our deadline. So don't forget. Also, I'd like to announce that we will hold a bonus informal interactive webinar session titled Ask Your Course Facilitator. During the session, I will answer any questions you may have about the online lessons. The session will take place this Thursday, February 8, from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. New York time. So save the date. Also, please check our website, www.nbsapforum.net, to get the latest news regarding this webinar and the Introduction to Resilience for Development MOOC. There you will also find a PDF copy of Andrew's presentation and a link to the recording, which will be available on our YouTube channel. For further information, please visit the NBSAP Forum or follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Also, please remember to register or update your profile. The NBSAP Forum is a global partnership to support the development and implementation of effective national biodiversity strategies and action plans, NBSAPs. It is hosted by the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the United Nations Development Program, and the United Nations Environment Program. I'm Marcela Torres, and on behalf of the NBSAP Forum, I hope you all enjoy this session. Have a great day or evening, and we'll see you next Thursday.